Hello, welcome back to the Brendan O'Neill Show with me, Brendan O'Neill, and my special guest this week, Fiona McAnena. Fiona, welcome to the show.
Hi, Brendan.
It's great to have you on this week, this somewhat controversial week in relation to things that are happening at the Olympics, particularly in women's boxing. And I was very keen to speak to you in your capacity as Director of Campaigns at Sex Matters and previously the excellent work that you've been doing at Fair Play for Women, both of which are organisations that explore the ways in which gender ideology harms women's rights, women's safety, and in relation to some of what we're talking about today, women's sports. So there's a lot to talk about. There's a lot to chew over, I think. And I want to kick off with the question of the moment. A lot of people around the world are talking about it, which is the fact that at the Paris 2024 Olympics, there are two boxers in the women's category who many of us believe don't belong there. There's Iman Khalif from Algeria and Lin Yu Ting from Taiwan, both of whom have failed gender eligibility tests in the past, and both of whom were banished from the Women's World Championship for failing a genetic test, which seemed to show that they have XY chromosomes, which means they would not be female. So it's a huge controversy. It's caused a huge storm. I wonder if you could tell us what you understand about this case and how you see it fitting into the broader discussion about women's sports today.
The boxing case has got a few moving parts. So one of them is the political row between the IOC and the International Boxing Association. The IBA was stripped of its recognition by the IOC in 2019. And so the boxing at the Olympics is not being run by a boxing authority. All the other events are run by international federations for the sport, World Athletics, World Aquatics, and so on. But the boxing at the Olympics is being run by the IOC itself. They did in Tokyo and they're doing it again here in Paris. So we'll come back to why that matters. What seems to be happening in the boxing ring is that these two individuals seem to punch a lot harder than their opponents are used to. And there have been mutterings for some time about the possibility that they are male. Now, you might think, how on earth is it possible for a man to be in a women's boxing competition? What we believe is the case with these two, but we don't know for sure. We believe they have the same condition that Caster Semenya, the South African runner, has. So in some situations, babies are born with ambiguous genitals. And in a developed country, they'll tend to get some investigation. It'll be found out if something hasn't gone quite right in the baby's development in the womb. It'll be identified and they can be treated. Sometimes they don't need treatment. You just know that that's what you've got. And we think that these two boxers probably have the same condition as Semenya, which is one where little boy babies are born with genitals that don't look quite right. And so they're registered as girls at birth. But they have internal testes, they produce testosterone, and as they go through their childhood and then their teenage years, it becomes apparent that they are boys, they masculinize, they produce testosterone, and as adults, they have all the advantages of male puberty that particularly matter in sport. So you have people registered female, and this is Semenya's argument always. You know, I was born a woman, I was raised a girl. That's what's being said by these two boxers, and that's what the IOC are saying about them. But the fact of the matter is that if a mistake is made with a little baby when they're born and they're registered female, it doesn't make them female. And if the IOC wanted these two boxers to stop getting the kind of scrutiny they're getting, there's a very easy test you can do, which is a cheek swab test, and you can quickly verify what sex they are. Now, what we're told the IBA did was blood tests, both in 2022 at the World Championships and then subsequently the following year in 2023. So I think we're now not in any doubt that these two boxers have XY chromosomes, and it seems that they have the ability to produce and process testosterone. And if you think about a very experienced boxer like Angela Kini, who faced Khalif in one of the early rounds, she said, "I've never felt a punch like it." And of course, male punching power is more than double female punching power, even at a matched weight. So we don't know for sure what condition they have, but all the indicators are they are male, they've had male development. Maybe they thought they were girls, maybe their parents thought they were girls, but mistakes can be made.
That's a very useful explainer, and listeners will appreciate that because it can get very difficult to follow cases like this because of the noise surrounding them, particularly coming from those who claim to be on the side of the two boxers, who will accuse women like you and other critically minded people of being bigots and closed-minded, and there is this tendency to close the discussion down. So it's really useful to have a very simple, straightforward explanation of what the story here might be. And explain to us a little bit about, so if it's the case, as you say, we don't know what developmental disorder of sex development they might have, although the evidence does suggest that they have XY chromosomes. That's what the Boxing Association says. And that does suggest that they may very well have been mistaken for girls or brought up as girls when they were young, but that will have become clear during puberty that wasn't quite the case. What does that mean in terms of their strength and their power? You've mentioned there that biological males have a much greater punching power than women, which is why we have sex discrimination in this sport and many other sports. What does it mean if someone has gone through male puberty, if they've had that rush of testosterone that is naturally produced, which surges through the body? What changes take place, which means not only is it unfair for someone like that to take part in women's boxing, but potentially dangerous as well?
There's a very long list of changes that happen in puberty. And of course, women's bodies change too. And they change in a different direction that is not so well adapted for most sports. One of the most obvious differences is the amount of muscle relative to the body weight that men have compared to women. Men have often twice as much muscle as women do. And we have correspondingly more fat to carry, which makes us less efficient. Another huge difference is bone density, which, increases strength, resistance, stiffer tendons, which mean that you have basically stronger levers. And that's before you think about the fact that men on average are just bigger. Male blood has more oxygenating capacity. So even though you have more blood, every litre of your blood can carry more oxygen to your muscles than a litre of my blood. So you can do more work. A significant thing is pelvis. So women's pelvises widen at puberty, obviously so that they can let a baby out later. Men's pelvises stay narrow. That's one of the very significant things in sporting performance, because a straighter leg drive that men have is just more efficient. In fact, one of the reasons why women in football get a lot more ACL injuries is because, unfortunately, with our wider pelvises, our knees are at a bit of an angle. So we're more prone to knee injuries. And that's before you think about the fact that women have to manage their periods and deal with all kinds of other things. So there are just so many ways in which male and female bodies differ. And that was never controversial, was it? We didn't have to talk about it. That's why almost every sport separates male and female, so that we can celebrate the best men and the best women. But I think that people, because sport has been separated by sex for so long, I think people don't understand just how massive that performance gulf is. So let me give you a couple of examples and then we'll come back to boxing. In weightlifting, the 55 kilo men lift about the same as the 87 kilo women. People say, oh, there must be a better way to organize sport. Let's do it by size. Well, there's the proof that doing it by size is no good, because those 55 kilo men don't have all the extra weight, but they can still do that performance. In athletics, the world's best times for every event that women do, from the 100-meter sprint to the marathon, and all the throwing events and everything else, jumping, long jump, high jump, they've all been beaten by teenage boys. Every single one. So the best woman in the world at every event can be beaten by a teenage boy. And every year there are hundreds, sometimes thousands of male performances that are better than those world records. It really is, unfortunately, a massive gulf, and it's not sexist to say so, although some people think it is. The important thing to remember is just because the very best woman might beat a man doesn't mean that she should have to compete against men. Caster Semenya is not a brilliant runner. Caster Semenya is a good male runner. So when people say, well, sometimes this person doesn't win, they've said that about the boxers. Khalif's been beaten 9 times, apparently. What does that prove? It proves he's not a very good boxer. Or maybe in boxing, it's easy to throw a match, I don't know. But it's not a gotcha to say, this person doesn't always win, therefore you're wrong. They're a woman, they're not male. That proves nothing. It's uncontroversial that male and female bodies need different spaces in which to shine. Ironically, the only things where women would probably outperform men are in gymnastics, because if you look at the disciplines that have evolved for male and female gymnasts, they're really very different. So men do that spectacular upper body strength, they do that crucifix position on the rings and things like that. And women do balance things. Women do the beam, which men don't do. So that in itself is a clear indication of how fundamentally differently those bodies work.
Yeah. Absolutely. Like you, I find it so frustrating when people say it's sexist to point out these differences in relation to how men and women do sports or what their bodies are like. And some people will often say, oh, are you saying that women's sports are rubbish? And you think, no, I'm not saying that at all. I'm actually saying they're important, and these women have achieved the height of sporting excellence, and that's why men should stay out in order that women can keep making those brilliant achievements. In relation to Khalif and Lynn, the two biological males at the centre of this storm, I did want to ask you how different you think they are to some of the other trans controversies we've seen in sport. Now, it's a difficult question because the consequences are arguably the same, which is that you have biological males in women's sports where they don't belong. But would it be fair to say that these two individuals are different in some ways to, for example, Leah Thomas, who was clearly male from the very beginning of his life and who decided later in life that he was going to become a woman? I'm doing air quotes around become a woman, and then cheated women out of medals that they had worked for their whole lives. And he is a big bloke, huge shoulders, big hands. If you've ever seen the photograph of him diving off the starting point alongside the women, you can see how he's gone so much further, even at the very beginning of the race, never mind the rest of it. People like him, I think, are pretty clear cheats who are robbing women of glory that they deserve. Now, the consequence with Khalif and Lynn might be the same, but the origin stories are slightly different, would you say? How do you understand the difference between a DSD athlete and a supposed trans woman athlete?
I think you're right to say the origin stories are different. That's a great way to put it. I mean, none of us know how other people feel, although Leah Thomas claims to know what it feels like to be a woman. But that aside, it's believed that these boxers like Caster Semenya, and indeed the other two who took the medals in the Rio 800 meters, so, that was a podium where all three winners were DSD males. It's believed that they were registered female at birth, and the IOC insists that they were born female, although how they can say that, I don't know. They weren't there, but their proof is that their passport says they're female. So let's assume that they've always had a female passport, although even in this country, you can change the sex marker on your passport. You don't even need special legal proof of anything. You just get a letter from your GP. But let's give these athletes the benefit of the doubt, these boxers. They may well have been registered female at birth for reasons we've discussed, and they may have been surprised by their own development. And I think a lot of people feel sympathy for them. Certainly, there's often a lot of sympathy around for Caster Semenya. People say, oh, they're females with high testosterone. They're not. They're males with normal testosterone. But either way, if you think you're a girl and you turn out to be a boy, and it turns out you'll never carry a baby, you may not, in fact, have fertility even as a male. Maybe you will, maybe you won't. That can be pretty shocking and traumatic. That is different, I think, from the person who declares that they want to change sex or that they feel like the other sex. Maybe some of those people feel trauma. I don't know. It's not for me to say. I think in the end, though, what we have to do is centre women in our own sports category. One of the most shocking things and upsetting things, I think, for women is how everyone's so keen to empathise about these poor people, whether they're traumatised by being DSD or whether they're finding life tough because their inner woman, isn't manifest in their outer male body, or whatever the issue is. Everyone's so keen to solve their problems, but in doing so, they have no regard for the women who are being imposed upon. And I suppose for me, it's the ultimate proof of the intrinsic sexism of the world. It's shocking that we're saying we all must worry about these people and we must accommodate them. And, women's sport is not a consolation prize for men or boys who've had difficult upbringings. It doesn't matter. It's tough. Maybe we have to find other ways to try and ease the burden of their lives. But getting an Olympic medal, most of us will never do that. And I often think of the three women in the Rio 800 metres in 2016 who finished 4th, 5th and 6th. Lindsay Sharp, the Scottish runner who finished 6th. No one seems to care about them, but they should be Olympic medalists. So they are different origin stories, but what's been so interesting about the boxing is how clear it has made it that the outcome is the same, which is that women lose out, and in fact, women are even put at risk. Let me say one more thing about boxing, just to illustrate how much risk these women are facing. When a man of equal weight punches a woman, that's roughly the same as a heavyweight man punching a lightweight man. That's what it would be like. Now, you cannot imagine, can you, letting a heavyweight boxer into the ring with a lightweight boxer. As soon as the first punch was thrown, people would be saying, stop, this isn't sport. But that's what we're looking at. So you said, are they cheating or they're all cheating? I don't tend to use the word cheating in the same way that I don't care what their motivation is. I don't care if they genuinely feel like women or if they never knew they were male. I don't care if they mean to take advantage or they don't mean to take advantage. It's not their category. And equally, I don't think about whether they're cheating or not. I am determined to change the rules back to how they're meant to be, to exclude all male advantage from the female category. That's all that matters. And we all know that matters. And we have these categories and no one is saying, well, the IOC are sort of saying we can't really tell who's male and female, which is quite bizarre because they're still saying you need separate categories. So everyone is saying, of course you separate male and female, but then they're saying, but we've got to make some exceptions for these poor people because they feel something special. So I don't tend to call it cheating because unfortunately, sporting authorities have made it okay for them. They've legitimized it. And these people, perhaps with their sense of entitlement or opportunistically or for whatever reason, they're just walking through an open door.
Here at Spiked, we know that many of you probably have a great business idea, but actually turning that idea into the real deal can be full of challenges. Luckily, there's a way to make your first step easy, and it sounds like this. That's the sound of another sale on Shopify, the game-changing all-in-one commerce platform that empowers you to become your own boss. Shopify enables up-and-coming entrepreneurs like you across the world, whether you trade in homemade snacks or vintage Macs, by simplifying how you can sell products both in-store and online. Your big idea can now become your full-time job. Shopify helps you grow your business by bringing everything under one digital umbrella. Through Shopify's simple dashboard and shop-ready point-of-sale system, managing orders and payments becomes effortless, so you have more time to focus on the bigger picture. Plus, Shopify will help you put your brand on those all-too-crucial social media platforms. From TikTok to Instagram, you'll easily be able to reach your potential customers wherever they may be. And don't worry about losing control of your business. Shopify gives you all the tools and business courses you need to stay one step ahead of the competition. And through Shopify's simple customization tools, keeping your unique image will never be a problem. So why wait? If you want to bring your business idea to life, get started with Shopify today. Sign up for a £1 per month trial period at shopify.co.uk/Brendan. That's shopify.co.uk/Brendan to take your business to the next level today. Shopify.co.uk/Brendan. That's quite right. And you can really see the power differential that you described there between what it's like when a man hits a female boxer. As you mentioned earlier, Angela Kini from Italy, that was really summed up in her experience where she pulled out of her clash with Khalif after 46 seconds and she said she was hit so hard she couldn't breathe. Now, I know boxing is a tough game, but it's not meant to be like that. It's not meant to have that extraordinary imbalance of power and strength. That's when it crosses the line from sport into something much darker. You mentioned there the phrase intrinsic sexism. And speaking of intrinsic sexism, I wanted to ask you about the International Olympic Committee, the IOC, and their relationship or lack of one with the International Boxing Association. I wonder if you could talk a bit about that, because I think that's probably causing people a bit of confusion as they're trying to follow this incredibly important story about fairness in sport. Because what we can see is the IBA has tested Khalif and Lin a couple of times and decreed that they have XY chromosomes and they're unsuitable for women's boxing. And the IOC has basically just said, we don't agree. We're going to let them into Paris 2024 anyway. So what are the tensions there? What's that relationship all about?
Well, most of us were barely aware of the IBA until this all happened. And they held a somewhat shambolic media conference in which a very coherent Englishman called Chris Roberts, who's the chief exec, explained about all the testing, as you've just summed up. And then the Russian president ranted in Russian and apparently said some very offensive things about Thomas Bach, who's the president of the IOC. So what seems to have happened is that in 2018, two senior executives, Chris Roberts' predecessor and possibly the finance director at the IBA, were fired for corruption. And then new people came in, a new president took over. We've got this Russian president now who's allegedly close to the Kremlin. In 2019, because of the previous corruption, the IOC said, we don't recognize you anymore as the International Federation for Boxing. Boxing's always been a very fragmented world anyway. You know, there's all these different organizations that run different championships. So the IOC took over the running of the boxing at Tokyo. The IBA went to court, the Court of Arbitration for Sport, which is the ultimate court in Switzerland where everybody goes when they have a sport issue. It's where Caster Semenya has been fighting with World Athletics for years. And in 2023, CAS dismissed the IBA's claim. And so that's why the IOC is running the boxing again in Paris in 2024. So there's massive tension between these two, and it's a lot to do with Russia, politics, and this ongoing battle. And it may well be that there's all kinds of corruption in boxing. I don't know. But what I do know is that doesn't mean they're wrong when they get a lab to run sex tests. The IOC, however, has basically used that tension to suggest that you can't trust a word that the IBA say. Now, even if that were true, if I were either of these boxers or their coach or their National Olympic Committee or the IOC, and I thought the IBA was lying, I could easily prove them wrong, couldn't I? I could have a cheek swab test, and in 3 hours, someone could have processed that and said, Fiona, you are a woman. And, you know, this isn't about policing gender norms or anything like that. In fact, female boxers are among the most gender non-conforming sportswomen you can find. And sportswomen generally are pretty gender non-conforming. So this isn't about how they look. It's just about whether they bring this overwhelming male advantage. So the IOC have been very dismissive of everything the IBA have said. The IBA have fought back and released documents, and they've released a letter that they sent a year ago to the IOC telling them about these results. And that was very revealing because the IOC had previously said they had no knowledge of the tests. So the IOC are looking pretty bad. The other thing we found out yesterday is that in the IBA conference is that the National Olympic Committees of Algeria and Chinese Taipei had written to the IBA saying, do not release the test details of our boxers. So if they wanted this storm to go away, that could be done. There's one thing we should say, which is the IOC is very committed to upholding the notion that all that matters is how you identify. This is not an accident. This is not a misunderstanding. You know, they issued a media guide before these games started saying you're not allowed to say things like biological male or born male. They issued a framework document in 2021 saying there should be no presumed advantage for someone with a transgender identity or difference of sex development. So they're very committed to the idea that if these boxers say they're women, that's all that matters. And they seem to be actually quite annoyed that the IBA had even done any sex testing. So it's not just about the politics, it's about a real commitment at the IOC to the idea that identity is what matters. And that, in a way, is what brings this all back to the transgender issue. Because, you know, DSD athletes do have passports that have probably always said female, and then they find out they're not and all of that. But they've legally been a slightly harder issue to deal with because they have always been registered as that sex. Transgender, much easier to deal with because it's much more obvious. There's a clear track record that says Leah Thomas was male and then Leah Thomas decided to be a woman instead. World Athletics has been fighting Caster Semenya in the court since 2016 because it's more difficult when someone has been registered female at birth. But the IOC has no problem with that. They are absolutely committed to saying whatever you say you are at any point in time is what you are. And I think that's what is hard for people to believe. The IOC is the highest sporting authority in the world. How could they really subscribe to that? But they really do. And that's what we're seeing here in Paris. And that's what's so astonishing, that we're seeing it in boxing of all things, simply because they've fallen out with the IBA over other matters.
I mean, it is just extraordinary. And I did actually want to ask you about, why do you think the IOC subscribes to this idea that many of us think is fantastical and ridiculous and sexist? Is it a case of ideological capture, which is not a phrase I particularly like, but people know what it means, that, you know, they've fallen for a fashionable ideology and not thought through the consequences that this ideology will have for sports people, or sportswomen rather. Is that what's going on here? Is it really just the case that they are elevating virtue signalling over not only women's rights, but in this case, women's safety? I mean, is that how ruthless you think the IOC is being, where it gives more credence to its own ability to advertise how correct thinking and right on it is than it does to the safety of women in the boxing ring?
It's hard to find any other explanation, because when people in sport, really engaged in sport, are asked about this, by and large, they don't support it. You know, the UK sports councils did a big process 3 years ago. They consulted loads of people who worked in sport, and they found a really clear dichotomy where coaches, athletes, people in sports management believed in sex reality and believed that you had to find other ways to accommodate people who were uncomfortable with their birth sex. The EDI people, the equality, diversity and inclusion people in sports, they were the ones who said, no, you must respect identities. And we have heard anecdotally that the same kind of division arose when the IOC consulted on this in 2021-22, and that the virtue signalers have won out. And, you know, this is a very strong belief system in North America. North American sponsors are very important to the IOC. I still think most of the people who work for those sponsors know the difference between men and women. But if they're not close to sport, they may not think it matters very much. Or they think that a really talented woman's going to beat a man, or they think that trans women aren't going to be that interested in sport, or they give themselves excuses like that to say it doesn't matter. And they fail to realize that one county level man could turn up in an Olympic team. So it's not that there's a vanishingly rare possibility of this happening. This is guaranteed to happen. So back to your question, there must be a lot of people in the IOC now watching those daily media briefings and squirming, because they're having to say crazy things. And they're having to say two things that mutually contradict. They're having to say, on the one hand, nobody really knows how to define a woman. There's no scientific consensus. They've literally said these words. There's no scientific consensus. No one really knows. If anyone's got the answer, please tell. We're all ears. And on the other hand, Khalif and Lynn, they're definitely women. Oh yeah, definitely women, no doubt at all. So it just doesn't stand up to any scrutiny.
It really doesn't. This might be an obvious question, but I wanted to ask you why there is such a dismissive attitude towards women's sports. I mean, you've already talked about intrinsic sexism, and I'm sure that's part of the answer. But when you think about it, it has been going on for a very long time. I mean, even before gender ideology really took off. When you speak to someone like Sharon Davis, who we've had on this podcast a couple of times, she talks in great detail about what she experienced in the 1980s when she was taking part in Olympics, when she was put up against East German women who were being doped by their managers. So she had to lose to women who were on a synthetic form of testosterone, which gave them an unfair advantage. And you fast forward to the 2020s and women are having to lose to people with a natural form of testosterone, which, as you've described, gives them an unfair advantage. So for decades now, the IOC and others have not taken seriously the importance of protecting women's sports from the invasion of either fake levels of testosterone or real levels of testosterone in participants. What's going on there? Is it sexism? I'm sure a large part of it is. Or do they just think women's sports is a joke? It's not as serious as the men's. It doesn't matter. Is that the attitude here?
Well, I think that must be the attitude that many people hold. And, you know, in the end, men do run faster and jump higher, kick a ball harder and everything else. And if that's what they think the pinnacle of sporting achievement is about, then it's a legitimate position to say, do you know what, we only really are interested in the fastest, strongest people. But that's not what the IOC profess. They profess to believe in the rights of everyone, the human rights of everyone. They've been trumpeting these Paris Games as being the first that have got gender equality, by which they mean equal numbers of events for men and women. So people are entitled to be sexist, I suppose, but they're really not entitled to be hypocritical. That's what they're doing here. I think what troubles people most about the IOC is the sanctimony, that they sit there and pontificate about all the good they're doing in the world, and then they don't care if that means that a man is hitting a woman. And they will sit straight-faced in press conferences and tell us both those things. It's baffling. And Sharon may have told you that, of course, when those women were being doped in East Germany, they didn't know they were being doped, poor things. And yet, for all the doping that went on, shameless doping, those women's performances did not approach those of men. So that's a really good demonstration of the profound difference between male and female performance, that naturally performing men, which is what we believe some of these athletes are with their trans identities or their DSDs, they have so much advantage that even if all the women were allowed to dope, they still couldn't close the gap.
That's a really important point. It really spells it out very clearly. Do you have any sense of how difficult it is for sports people to speak out? So you've already mentioned that when there are surveys and polls of sporting people, there is a general recognition that this is unfair, it's not right, and you do need to divide the sports according to sex. I think it's probably hard for them to get onto a podium or a soapbox and make those points clearly because of the tendency of many people in society to shoot down what are referred to as gender critical women or anyone who stands up for the reality of sex. I mean, there are some great sportswomen speaking out. Sharon Davis is one, for example. Nicola Adams, the boxer, has recently spoken out about what's happening at Paris 2024. Martina Navratilova, of course. They are really stating very clearly that this is a grotesque assault on women's sports. But do you get the sense that there are probably other sportswomen and possibly sportsmen out there, Barry McGuigan has spoken out as well, which is great, who would like to speak out, but the culture and the atmosphere is sometimes so stifling and even threatening that they think, I'm just going to keep my head down?
Yeah, without a doubt. There's lots and lots of that. I mean, I will mention, we're also very thankful for Mara Yamauchi, the marathon runner, who's been very brave. And I know Sharon's great friend, Daley Thompson, has been a stalwart. And he says he doesn't get anything like the abuse that, Sharon gets. But yes, when I was with Fair Play for Women, we compiled a report of testimony from women and girls. And it's on the fairplayforwomen.com website about how male inclusion was leading to female exclusion, how it was harming women and girls. And there are countless testimonies in there of women being intimidated or being told off or being ostracized. And in fact, when the sports councils did their work, they found exactly the same. They found people who were afraid to talk to them. They were literally afraid to talk to them. They said, I can only talk to you if it's anonymous. Like, these are professionals working in sport, talking to consultants doing an official piece of work in an area of sports policy, which normally would be rather dull sports policy. But here they are, crying in the interviews. I mean, it's incredible. It's all documented by the sports councils. And when I saw Angela Carini, the Italian boxer, apologize, I thought, I know what that is. I know what that is. That's your sponsorship. Someone said to you, you need to put this right or you're going to lose your sponsor, because that's another thing we've been told. And we've heard that even from elite British women. There are women competing in Paris now that I have talked to who have said, I can't say anything because my manager has said I might lose my sponsorship. I don't dare. So it's really difficult, and women are absolutely silenced and bullied. And we have just countless stories of that kind.
The Carini case was extraordinary. So first she's punched in the face by a man in front of the whole world, and then she ends up saying sorry for it, essentially. As you say, it's clear that she was lent on, and it was understandable that she felt the need to make that apology in order to, I guess, preserve her career. And this is the pressures that some of these women face. It's really horrible. Moving it on to the broader question of the gender ideology and how it's going, I suppose, because it does seem to me that it's almost like one step forward, two steps back, or maybe one step forward, one step back, if I'm going to be a bit more optimistic, because some important developments have taken place in relation to pushing back against the gender ideology and the impact that it can have on women's rights and on children's safety. So we've had the Cass review, which the Labour government says it will implement, which will restrict the ability of people to prescribe puberty blockers, which is great. It means that young people are not going to have their bodies screwed up in the name of an ideology that doesn't make sense. We've also seen many cases where women have won employment tribunals, Maya Fostato being the clearest example, but there are others too, of course, where their right to express so-called gender-critical views or sex-realist views is now recognised as a right in law. These are protected beliefs. You cannot be punished or shamed or harassed or sacked for expressing them. That's another very positive development. So all that's great. And then you switch on the TV and you see a man hitting a woman, or you still see that kind of very restrictive climate around people's ability to speak freely on these issues. So how do you see the balance at the moment in relation to this ideological question more broadly?
I think I'm more optimistic than you. I think it's two steps forward and one step back. We did some polling at Sex Matters just before the UK general election. And when you ask the actual questions, you know, whether you think it should be easier for people to change the sex on their birth certificate, people don't think that's a good thing. They're beginning to understand that that has consequences. Everyone believes people should be free to live their life, you know, expressing how they wish and all of the rest of it. But they're beginning also to understand that there are some areas of conflict when you let people pretend to be the other sex. And there's falling support in consequence for those things. And when you recenter the conversation, as I prefer to do, around the needs of particular groups, you mentioned children. When you talk to people about children and should children be allowed to have gender-affirming care, which means, of course, puberty blockers and then cross-sex hormones, people almost universally say they're too young. How can they know that? You know, children go through all sorts of phases. So when you move the conversation away from this general kind of trans rights thing, where most people would say, of course we should have trans rights, and you talk about the specific consequences, and men and women's sport is another one, you get a very strong majority seeing things the way we do, which is that that's one of the areas where the reality of sex cannot be ignored. And someone else can pretend to have changed sex, but I don't have to pretend that person has changed sex. Now, you were talking before about, you know, the IOC, and has this been a long process for them in how they trivialize women's sport? I think that when you look at the early thinking at the IOC about allowing people with transgender identities into women's sport, it is a kind of indication of why gender ideology has become so intrusive in women's lives across a range of areas. I wrote a piece for Spiked Online just before Christmas called Trans Colonization in Women's Sport. And way back 20 years ago, when the IOC first changed their rules, one of the people who was very influential said that he thought that there wouldn't be very many transsexuals, as they called them, male transsexuals who'd want into women's sport. And they'd probably mostly be in masters sport and it wouldn't really matter. So what he was saying was older women don't matter. By talking about it'll happen in masters sport, so it won't matter, he was saying it'll only affect older women. And who cares about them? And I kind of think that is an indication of how this issue has played out more broadly, that when women like me raise the alarm, actually, society sees our role as being to accommodate other people and their problems. You know, it's like we're everybody's mother. And so if I complain, it's like, oh, come on, it's just put up with it. What's your problem? But when we focus on teenage girls and their distress, or ambitious young women with potentially a career in sport ahead of them, people can maybe find a bit more empathy than they can do for middle-aged women. And I see big steps in the Labour government. And, you know, a few years ago, they were all trans women are women, end of story. I think they're beginning to see it's not that simple, that you do have to address individual issues like the healthcare one. You mentioned the Cass review. So I'm quite hopeful that people are beginning to understand that it's not that we all want to bang on about trans rights and why are we spending so much time worrying about a tiny minority. It's that actually women, we're full human beings too. The IOC might not care very much about women's sport, or some people might not care about women's sport. They might find, you know, women's football rather slow, but it matters to us. It matters to us. And so we're allowed to have it. And the big step that I think we're still trying to make is for other people, namely men, but many women too, to find it acceptable that women would advocate for ourselves, that we think we're entitled to sport, for example, rather than thinking we should sublimate our own needs and accommodate these distressed individuals with their gender issues or whatever it might be. So that macro view of it, I think, is still really tough to get people on board with. But the specifics, and particularly children in sport, those are really cutting through. And honestly, we don't need to solve the universal problem of, sexism and female socialization to accommodate men and all that, or at least I'd like to, but I don't think I'm going to succeed. But we can absolutely solve some of these individual problems. And the Cass Review is rippling around the world, and that is going to protect a lot of children. That is a marvelous thing. She absolutely deserves to be Lady Cass or Baroness Cass or whatever she is. And the great thing about that is that review was commissioned by a Conservative Secretary of State for Health and is being implemented by a Labour Secretary of State for Health. So if we can see this issue be depoliticized, then we have a much better chance of addressing some of the other manifestations of it as well.
If you're a regular listener to this show or a regular reader of Spiked, why not become a Spiked supporter? Spiked Supporters is our thriving community of people who donate to Spiked. Anyone who gives £5 or more a month or £50 or more a year can become a Spiked supporter and get access to lots of exciting perks. Spiked supporters can comment on articles, get free and discounted tickets to events, get a discount on all items in our shop, and bookmark articles as you browse. This is our way of saying thank you to all of you who fund our work. Spiked is completely free, and yet you still hand over your hard-earned cash to make sure that anyone, anywhere can read us and listen to us. We're incredibly grateful for your generosity. If you don't give to Spiked yet, now is the perfect time to start. Just go to spiked-online.com/supporters to set up your donation and your Spiked supporters account. That's spiked-online.com/supporters. Yeah, I think you're right that when it comes to girls or young people and also women's sports, or certainly younger women's sports, I guess, there is a much more open attitude to challenging the stranglehold of gender ideology in those areas of life. When it comes to women who might be a little bit older, that doesn't necessarily apply as much. And in fact, if you look at the trans lobby specifically, not only is there a lot of sexism in that lobby or outright misogyny, there's also a lot of ageism. I mean, the way they talk about gender critical women, not only do they say misogynistic things about them, but they will often say ageist things about them. These middle-aged, barren, old women. I mean, they really do talk about that. I'm not even making it up. If you read Grace Lavery's book, for example, which I had to do in order to review it, I mean, there are some really sexist and ageist comments. On your optimism, which I'm very happy to hear, I want to ask you how you think these achievements came about, because, I mean, it seems pretty obvious, which is that I don't think any of these achievements would have come about if difficult women hadn't spoken up and done something. So whenever someone asks me about, recent examples of campaigning that has worked and really had a benefit for society, the one that always comes to mind is gender critical feminism or sex realism. I know there are different ways to describe it, because it really is only as a consequence of feminists, some don't even refer to themselves as feminists, but these groups of women with male allies putting their necks on the line and weathering the storm of misogyny to make these points. That's how this has come about, isn't it? It's a testament to the importance of collective action, I guess.
Yeah, I think it's really hard to single out critical moments or critical individuals, because there have been so many. It's been a cumulative effort. It's taken a lot of courage. I think it's been done by older women for the most part, because we have more perspective on life. We have less dependency on men, if I'm honest, than young women do. Perhaps we have, as a group, those of us who are activists, a bit more financial independence that has made this more possible. So there might be some sort of shared factors there. I have to say, though, if I really were to try and name some individuals, there's a few trans people I would call out. I mean, Leah Thomas did us all a big favour, and I think that it was only when sports bodies saw how bad that looked And they thought, we don't want that happening to us. And I'm really hoping that the boxing is going to make a few more sports federations now say, I don't want us to be the ones with the press conference next time trying to argue that we don't know what a woman is, but we know these people are women. So from time to time, Operation Let Them Speak does its work. I mean, Isla Bryson obviously is another one. That was critical. And whoever took that fabulous photograph with the pink leggings. So as so often, you can have all the rational arguments and all the data and all reason on your side. But when you trigger an emotional response, suddenly people can see for themselves. That's very powerful. I don't think we've fully got there yet with children. I think there are a lot of people who still think that some children are born somehow trans. And that makes me sad, because I think there are a lot of children who are confused about, what it means to be a boy or a girl. But we used to address that by telling them that boys and girls could do all the same things, that you can do anything. Boys can play with dolls, girls can climb trees. And now we seem to have gone the other way. And that's a bit sad. And then, of course, as you'll know, the other scary part is same-sex attraction, that little boys who express themselves effeminately are more likely to grow up to be gay, and little girls who are gender non-conforming are more likely to grow up to be lesbian. And this ideology takes those little boys and girls and tells them that they're wrong in their bodies, and that's really disturbing. And then some of them do it to themselves, of course, when they're young adults. They're, sort of internalized homophobia. So that part I find still really disturbing. I'm not so optimistic there, but our healthcare system is sufficiently centralized and controlled that I think the worst excesses of activist doctors can be held in check. I don't think that's true in North America. If I were in North America now, I would be as pessimistic or more so than you are. And when I talk to colleagues in North America working in this field, they think we're the lucky ones because we're making progress, because we're starting to be able to have conversations and we're starting to get media coverage. Because that's the other thing. 80% of people still really know nothing about this. So we still do have a lot of work to do.
Okay, this is my last question for you, Fiona, and you might have just already answered it partly there, but I wanted to finish by asking you, what are the next frontiers? So you've mentioned that great leaps forward have been made in relation to the medicalisation of children via the Cass review. That's a wonderful thing. The discussion about women's sports is improving, and the concern about the mistreatment of young women is improving. That's all good. But there are many other things that need to be done. You will be more aware of that than most. Given that you are director of campaigns at Sex Matters, and given your interest in this issue more broadly, what do you think are the next frontiers that people really need to start thinking about in terms of challenging the influence of some of these ideological beliefs on women's rights and women's safety?
I would say two key things. So one of them is the general problem of single-sex provision, protecting single-sex spaces, and the drift away from that. There being men in women's prisons in California, for example. I mean, it's terrible in North America. Here in the UK, it's more about women's refuges, rape crisis, counselling services, medical care, and so on. I think that's still a problem, and we haven't really, because it's very sort of fragmented, we haven't really yet got a catalyst to fix that in the way that the Cass review does for children's healthcare. And then the other one, which I think people really should be worried about, is the proposal from this government to implement a ban on conversion therapy. Now, that might seem counterintuitive, because who on earth would be in favour of conversion therapy? But the Cass review has made really clear that if you talk about conversion therapy for gender identity and you say you're not allowed to do that, then what that means is that if an unhappy 13-year-old girl who maybe has found that she's attracted to her best friend, if that little girl says, I think I'm a boy, no one is allowed to question that. That's what a ban on conversion therapy for gender identity would mean. It would mean that young people would not get any help because therapists would be terrified of being criminalized for helping to explore why they might be wanting to change sex or why they might express a transgender identity. And the Cass review and the evidence from the clinics is very clear that there are so many reasons why someone might feel that they're not the sex they are, from sexual abuse, assault, childhood trauma, various kinds, being same-sex attracted, being autistic, all kinds of reasons. And almost every child who went through the UK Gender Clinic, the London clinic, the Tavistock, had some reason, because no one is really trans until afterwards. If you transition, then you're trans, but no one's born in the wrong body. So this notion of conversion therapy is potentially something that will push against the good that the Cass review will do. And Dr. Cass actually mentions it specifically. She says we cannot have a situation where people can't explore their patients' feelings. But we're already hearing about that therapists are afraid that if they see a young person who says, I'm trans, and they try to explore any reason why that person might feel unhappy in their body, that they could be in trouble. So I think the campaign to try and communicate to people that we mustn't ban talking therapy, because that's what it would be. That is the next frontier here in the UK.
Fiona, thank you very much.
Thank you, Brendan.
Thank you for listening to The Brendan O'Neill Show. We'll be back with another guest and more discussion. Don't forget to subscribe, and in the meantime, keep reading Spiked at www.spiked-online.com.